I can't tell you how tickled I am to be here, and I can't start this session without, David knew it was coming, telling the story of how we first met. It was the spring of 1994, I believe, and David was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News, and I was the White House correspondent for the Washington Post. And one of the great joys of my life, if you've ever gone back to some place you were in school or something as a success, David invited me back to speak to the annual banquet of the Yale Daily News. And he got up and gave a lovely talk and sat back down and forgot to introduce me until the president of the university sort of elbowed him. And he got back up and introduced me. So how magnificently funny is it that little David Leonhardt has grown up to be exactly what he was then, which is quite competent other than the introduction part. And esteemed David Leonhardt, the tables have turned. Not only am I his interviewer here, but back home in Washington, I have a side light occupation in addition to the column that I write twice a week as David Leonhardt's driver. Because we live in the same neighborhood, and we find ourselves, actually thanks to the magnificent David Bradley of The Atlantic, at dinners together quite often. And my role, I know, is driving David home. So far, he's been sitting in the passenger seat. But I expect in a few years, he'll be sitting in the back, and I'll just be saying, is the usual straight home, Mr. Leonhardt?
I'm enough of a New Yorker that I don't own a car, which is slightly embarrassing.
Is that right?
Well, we're a family, and we have one car. So.
We're a family, and we have 3 cars, so it may be even out. As Kitty said, if you haven't read David's book, you really ought to download it and read it, because it is the best, most accessible single explanation that I've read about the fiscal situation we find ourselves in and the path, at least the theoretical path, out of it. And my plug for the book is this: no matter where you are on the political spectrum, but absolutely certainly if you're somewhere on one side or another, but rather close to the middle, if you read this book, you will never have that moment again at a dinner party when somebody is saying something that you absolutely know is completely incorrect, like if only we didn't waste so much money on foreign aid, or if only we didn't overtax the rich, we would generate enough economic growth to solve our fiscal problems. If you read this book, you will always have the factoid and argument at hand to silence your dinner party companion who's driving you crazy. So the problem with me interviewing David today is that we completely agree on the fiscal issues. So what I'm going to do is pretend not to be me and give him a hard time about some of the things that he wrote. And David, I'm going to start with, isn't your book just totally outdated? And it's kind of quaintly moot. We've solved the deficit problem. Look at the recent CBO projections. The deficit is on a downward path faster than we expected. From the conservative point of view, the sequester has accomplished, in addition to the other budget cutting and tax raising events that we've had in the past, has accomplished the goal. And so problem solved. From the progressive point of view, our friends at places like the Center for American Progress say, okay, don't need to talk about austerity, don't need to talk about that much further deficit reduction. We're on a good path. So I'm really sorry that your timing was so bad. Please explain.
Please respond. I will. First of all, thank you for doing this. Obviously, as your story suggested, I've been a fan of Ruth's work for 20 years, so it's really a great thrill that she agreed to do this. I would say that anybody who is concerned about the deficit needs to acknowledge the progress that we've made in the last couple of years. We've made a ton of progress. When we all first started hearing the phrase Bowles-Simpson, the target that everyone put out there was $4 trillion of deficit reduction over 10 years. If you were at the panel with Jack Lew yesterday, you heard this. We have done $4 trillion of deficit reduction over 10 years. It hasn't come in the form of a grand bargain. It's come in the form of 4 or 5 mini bargains. The Democrats got a tax increase around the turn of the year. The Republicans got the sequestration spending cuts. Before that, the Republicans got some other spending cuts. So it's come in bits and pieces, but it's been a combination of taxes and spending. We have $4 trillion, as you mentioned. The deficit is coming down quite nicely at this point. And over the medium term, I think it's fair to say that the United States no longer has a severe medium-term deficit problem. And everyone who's concerned about the deficit, I think, needs to acknowledge that. But there are 2 big caveats, 2 answers to your question about why we still should talk about it.
Or why we should still download
Why you should still download my book, yes. The first is, I think, more familiar, so I'll just say it very briefly, which is we haven't come anywhere close to solving our long-term problem. Those same CBO projections that look really good in the short term, over the long term, as we get more baby boomer retirees, and as we get continuing increases in health costs, even at a somewhat slower rate, which we've had recently, the deficit starts to take off again. The second point, which I think is the less familiar one, is this whole question of the trade-offs between the future and the present, the trade-offs between investment and consumption, and the trade-offs, to be a little blunter about it, between the old and the young. Nearly all of our deficit solving so far, that $4 trillion over 10 years, has come at the expense of the young. We have left largely untouched Social Security and Medicare. And so as a society, what we're choosing to do is make our cuts on the young, on the future, on investment. The sequester applies to schools and it applies to scientific research. It doesn't apply to Social Security or Medicare. And I think it'd be really good if we could have a debate as a society about how much do we want to be spending on different age cohorts. It so happens that among rich countries, we're skewed. We have a substantially higher ratio of spending on the old to the young than most other rich countries. And so I guess that's what I worry about.
Good. And so just to continue on the poor David, he wrote his book too late line, and you alluded to this. So yes, as you explain quite well in the book, in the long term, the deficit problem and the debt problem is a healthcare spending problem.
Yes.
But we've also seen remarkable, somewhat explained, but still mysterious, and particularly mysterious in the sense of whether they will continue, declines in healthcare spending. So maybe just as we were a little bit wrong about how big the problem was in the medium term, maybe we've learned to tackle the health spending monster. Maybe all those projections are wrong as well. So why should we take drastic steps now in anticipation of a problem that might not happen? Haven't we solved, in addition to the deficit problem in the medium term, potentially solved the long-term problem also as we get health spending under control?
So the slowdown in healthcare spending is another one of those things that I think it's really important to acknowledge. I think and Ruth was saying before that when we get into the Q&A, we can expand the conversation as well. We can talk about anything that you all want, including journalism. I think one thing journalists struggle with is good news. I think it is hard often for journalists to figure out how to write good news stories. And as a result, it's not just journalists, we're human beings.
We know how to write them, we just don't know how to get them on the front page.
Yes, exactly. And so I think if healthcare spending over the last 2 or 3 years had really started taking off, I think in this room we would all be nodding our heads because we would have read dozens and dozens of stories and listened to many radio things and read dozens of blog posts about how healthcare spending is spiraling out of control. Well, I mean, we've put a bunch of stories on the front page about how healthcare spending is slowing, but it's not nearly the same attention it would get. And so, again, I think it's important to acknowledge healthcare spending has slowed sharply. And so as Ruth was saying, we think some of it is just the recession. When people have less money, they take fewer vacations. They also go to the doctor less often. But the people who study this the most seriously, David Cutler at Harvard, other people, I mean, the estimates of how much of the slowdown is secular, how much of it is because of changes in the healthcare system, sort of ranges from 20 to 50%, which is real. So we are in the midst of a real slowdown. So I would say conduct a little thought exercise. Imagine the slowdown is realer than we think. Imagine the slowdown is actually relatively little about the recession, and it's overwhelmingly about the fact that healthcare is managing to reorganize itself in important ways. I would argue that most of the changes in slowdown in healthcare spending so far is not because of Obamacare, but let's imagine the stuff that's in Obamacare turbocharges that stuff, and then basically our long-term problem, as Ruth was just positing, ends up being small. We still have that second problem I talked about. Even if we have no long-term deficit problem, we currently have a set of spending decisions today, not in the future, that is heavily skewed away from the future and toward the present. Healthcare is actually a great example. We spend more money than any country in the world. We're behind a lot of countries in terms of basic infrastructure like electronic records. Technology is a good example. No one buys more gadgets than we do, but we're behind the rest of the world in some of the broadband stuff. Look at the highways, right? Look at our schools. There are all kinds of ways. Look at scientific research. We whacked scientific research in the sequester. Look at how little we're spending on clean energy R&D. So even if you told me we have no long-term deficit problem, I would say to you, we have a different deficit right now, and that is an investment deficit. We're not spending enough, even at the exact same amount of spending. If we're just shifting, we're not spending enough on the things that may bring us economic growth in the future.
You said the magic words. I feel like the Groucho Marx show where the birdie would come down, because I wanted to actually talk about the role of economic growth, because that's another argument that we hear about the role of the deficit. If we have economic growth, all problems will be solved, which is true.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the role of economic growth, what you think we can expect, and what we can do to make it happen. In 5 easy lessons.
Yeah. So economic growth, as you said, what was the exact phrase you used, Jude? I mean, it solves everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like not that much of an exaggeration, actually. I think one of the best critiques of the economic policy of the left in this country, and we can do the critique of the right if you want, one of the best critiques of the economic policy of the left is that it is not sufficiently focused on growth, on the speed that we're growing. And that we should worry first about that, and then we should worry second about distribution. Because when you're growing rapidly, the pie is growing. Put it this way, we've never had a period of rapid economic growth in this country without really healthy wage increases for the poor and the middle class. Never. In the late 1990s, income inequality was increasing, but it was increasing because the people at the top were doing even better than the people in the middle at the bottom. People in the middle and the bottom were really doing quite well. Economic growth is obviously hugely important for American power in the world, right? If you're worried about us keeping up with the Chinese, nothing helps that more than economic growth. We're in this funny moment in which I'm an optimist by nature, and there's a part of me that wants to, whenever I hear this pessimistic talk about, oh my goodness, there are never going to be enough jobs, it's the new normal, it's stagnation, there's a part of me that wants to say, yeah, it was ever thus. Whenever we've come out of tough economic times in this country, people have said, we're never getting back to what we used to. I mean, go back and read some of the coverage when we came out of World War II. Think about what that was like in 1945, right? The only two things this country had known for 16 years was war or depression. That's it. That's all we'd known. And so the war was ending, and you can read all these pieces in places like the New Republic saying, get used to the new depression.
And the debt as a percentage of GDP then was
even
100 and something percent.
Yes, it was even higher than it ever was here, right? And yet, of course, what they didn't know in 1945 is they were on the cusp of the greatest economic boom arguably any country has ever known. And so there's a part of me that wants to say people always get too down at the end of bad periods. But I actually am not willing to be quite that optimistic or quite that glib, because we're also now at the end of 15 years of lousy economic growth, of essentially no growth in income for large portions of the population. And I actually think we need to engage seriously now with the question of, is there something really different about this time? Are we in some sort of actual Luddite era in which the modern Luddites won't look as wrong as the original Luddites?
Which leads to I was waiting for you to say the magic word education.
Yes.
Because I thought you were going to lead into that. On the one hand, we hear about the importance of education, the inequalities in access to education, the unaffordability of education. On the other hand, we hear questions about whether education really is the sensible investment. And I say this as somebody who's about to send one daughter off to private university next year. Am I making a good investment? Is she going to get the return on my investment? Talk a little bit about both sides of that coin, if you would.
I think one side of that coin is, what's the right metaphor here, is a lot heavier than the other side.
It's the coin's loaded or
yeah,
whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so here's my short answer. I'll give a slightly longer one. My short answer is all these education skeptics running around saying we have too many college graduates, education isn't worth it, there's a debt bubble, all those people, find me one of them not planning to send their own children to college. Just one. And when you do that, I would love to engage with that person in a debate about the value of education. But I think there's a reason why even the people who get up on panels and say, we're too educated, we have a debt bubble, college isn't worth it, too many kids are going, are all planning to send their own kids. And I think the reason is that education is still an enormously positive investment. There's a nice chart by the Hamilton Project in which they did some historical research comparing the return to college education to the return you get to gold, to real estate, to stocks, to anything. And college blows them all away. The gap between what people in college are making and what everyone else is making is at an all-time high. The unemployment rate for people between the ages of 25 and 34 who have a 4-year college degree is below 3.5%. I don't doubt that there are real struggles of particularly young college grads because we've just gone through the worst economic downturn in 75 years. It hasn't spared anyone. But the returns to education have never been higher. And I think if we wanted to make a list of optimistic things out there, you mentioned slowing down in healthcare, I would add the fact that this downturn has sent a lot of people back to school. And we've finally seen our college attainment starting to rise a little more quickly in the last few years.
You left out one part of that coin, which is access.
Well, okay, so that is, what I would say is, that's really important. What I would say is, education is an enormous force for economic good. It is basically people learning how to do things more efficiently and more effectively. So society has more things, it has better things, and people who want it can have more leisure. The downside is that while education is the single best force we have for increasing economic growth and economic mobility, it is doing a really poor job of the second of those two. There is a massive gap in terms of who actually goes to college. I don't know how many of you saw this, but there are a series of fascinating papers that have come out that I really recommend people read. If you want to read just one, it's by Chris Avery at Harvard, and the lead author is Caroline Hoxby at Stanford. And it points out that most low-income, high-performing kids don't go to one of the 200 most selective colleges in the country. So think about that for a second. You are a low-income kid. You've overcome the odds. You've done really well on the SATs, what I think of as back when it was at 1400, what was it, 1600? You know, maybe you've gotten a 1200 on the SATs, 1300. As a poor kid, you've overcome all this stuff. And then, instead of going to the University of Colorado at Boulder, or instead of going to, at the very high end, Duke, or instead of going to the University of California at Irvine, you go to your local community college and you don't graduate.
And you pay more, right? You end up, many of the kids who are in the cohort that you're talking about end up either, whether they're at their community college or a 4-year college, could get a better deal.
Yes.
At a private university that has need-blind admission or significant resources to help them afford their college, help them be able to graduate without a staggering burden of debt, and they end up at institutions that are actually charging them more.
Yes, so I think this was true a few years ago. I believe it's still true today. But if we have a Wisconsin higher education expert here who corrects me, I believe if you were an absolutely top poor kid in Wisconsin, you would pay less to go to the University of Wisconsin than you would to go to one of the University of Wisconsin at Madison than you would to go to one of the other University of Wisconsin campuses. And you would pay less to go to Harvard than you would to go to the University of Wisconsin at Madison.
So what's the reason that they posit for this mismatch? What are we going to do about it?
Some of it is, the good news is some of it's relatively easily solvable, which is when they've done interventions and they've given poor kids information about actual tuition, not list price tuition. Harvard doesn't actually cost $60,000 if you come from a family that makes $30,000 a year. It costs zero, a little bit more than zero, but Harvard will charge you zero. You give kids information about how well kids do when they get out. You give kids information about graduation rate. To be clear, I think community colleges are incredible places, which in some ways are doing much more important educational work than Harvard, right? These top universities take kids who would graduate from anywhere and then they just hang out with them for 4 years. And I actually think they do more than that. But the problem with the community colleges and the four-year colleges on the low end of the spectrum is they don't have a lot of resources. Their graduation rates are heartbreakingly low. And so the research shows the same kid who goes to one of those schools, the same kid, even with great incoming scores, is less likely to graduate. And so some of it can be getting kids information. But I think some of it is also taking more seriously the role that community colleges and the non-selective four-year colleges play. Over the last decade, we have shifted. The relative resources that we spend on community colleges has declined, and the relative resources we spend on University of Wisconsin-Madison and Harvard has increased, and that strikes me in an age of rising inequality as a problematic trend.
And this goes back to the point you were making about our distribution, our generational distribution of resources and investment. So we've had this lovely highfalutin talk about how we could solve our problems and the gravity of our problems. And now let's bring in, it's hard to say it in Aspen because it's so beautiful, but let's bring in the real world of Washington, where how many, you said Simpson-Bowles, by the way, you said it the wrong way, Bowles-Simpson. The reason they don't say it as Bowles-Simpson is think about the initials.
Oh, really?
Yes. So no, that if you talk to either one of them, they're very happy to have Simpson go first for that reason. But you don't need either Simpson or Bowles to come up with the solutions that absolutely every reasonable commission and panel and study entity and individual brilliant journalist has come up with to deal with our problems of fiscal sustainability and economic growth. But we've had demonstrated in exquisitely painful detail over the last several years a demonstration of some ability, as you say, to get deficit reduction. But I would argue, A, not enough, and B, as you've argued, not necessarily in the right way. That's putting it mildly, given the idiocy of the sequester. And going forward, you have a Republican Party that is absolutely allergic to the notion of any tax increase whatsoever. The president had asked originally for $1.6 trillion in new tax revenue. Speaker Boehner had offered $800 billion, and then I think it got notched up to $1 trillion. So in a way that only Washington can negotiate, they agreed on maybe $770 billion. You know, if that's a good negotiation, no business person in this room would have asked for 1.6, gotten offered 1, and settled for 770. But that's where we are. And now Republicans say, not a dime more, been there, done that, gave it the office. It's the end of new tax revenue. On the other hand, Democrats say, we're not doing it without new tax revenue. And in any event, we are tired of giving in programs for the vulnerable and needy, including every Social Security recipient, no matter how wealthy. Reasonable changes like changes in cost of living adjustments for every senior are viewed as evil and assaults on Social Security, which must remain viable. And let's not even talk about other more draconian entitlement changes. So when you look at, as the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, living in the real world, talk about how you see the political system handling the challenges that do remain, and whether you see a way out.
Yeah.
Please solve the problem.
Yeah.
Because you said you were optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's optimism with maybe 5 steps forward, 4 steps back. Maybe the steps back will come first. I think there are 2 things to talk about here. So one is, I do worry that both parties are in sort of agreement in a way that may not be healthy about this investment consumption young-old thing. I think it is very easy for the parties to go out and say, don't worry, we're never going to touch Social Security and Medicare without explaining to voters what kind of costs that brings in terms of cutting education or in terms of all kinds of other cuts. And I think both parties are sort of similarly to blame there. Democrats, because as Ruth was saying, they have this long-term, almost emotional connection to Social Security and Medicare in a way that makes it difficult for them to understand that, hey, saying you're for no changes to Social Security or Medicare doesn't just make you a progressive. It means you're making choices about what you don't want to spend on. Right? Is cutting money for highways and medical research and clean energy research and education progressive? I'm not sure that it is, and saying that you will not touch Medicare and Social Security means you want to cut from all those other things in all practical purposes. Republicans, of course, now rely on older voters ever more for their votes, and so they, if anything, have become more demagogic than Democrats on some of these cuts. The Democrats included Medicare cuts in Obamacare. So on the first point, I would say I think it's fair to look at the parties somewhat equally. On the second point, I think it's fair to say the Republicans are more at fault. And I think this is something, I actually think it's something, this is important for those of us in Washington to figure out ways how to do. You can look objectively at both parties, right? I said a few minutes ago that I think Democrats have had a harder time talking about the importance of economic growth. I would say Democrats have also had a harder time talking in an evidence-based way about how valuable education is. A lot of that skepticism is on the left. I think Republicans have been the less fiscally responsible party for about 20 years now. The deficit expanded under Ronald Reagan enormously. It fell under Bill Clinton. It expanded under George W. Bush. Obama's record is as yet incomplete, but there's a really good chance he's going to have a claim on, in the fairest way you measure it, on cutting the deficit. And so I think when you look at today's Republican Party, what you have to say is it's a party that is deeply consistent with its philosophical beliefs, but sometimes so consistent that it ignores evidence to the contrary. Cutting tax rates at the very top doesn't appear to be the best strategy for economic growth. It doesn't appear to be the best strategy for reducing the deficit. We now have 20 years of evidence on this point. I mean, it is fabulous to go back and look at the quotes about when Bill Clinton proposed raising high-end tax rates in 1993, about how terrible this would be for the economy. It is just delicious, because in 2013, we know what followed, right? The best economic boom in 40 years and surpluses. And yet you read these predictions of doom. And I think anyone who says that the biggest problem we have in this country is tax rates at the top should go back and read that and engage with that a little bit and say, why is it that all those predictions proved spectacularly wrong? And I think, so one of the big questions is, do Republicans get to the point where they want to negotiate? To use your example, when the opening bids are 800 and 1.6, can they settle at 1.2? And right now, Republicans have decided they are happy playing to their base, which gives them the House of Representatives, but it's one of the reasons they've lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections. My prediction would be Republicans are not yet ready to be a kind of compromise negotiating party, and that they're either going to win, and they're going to get the presidency and Congress at some point in the next 5 years, and they're going to put in some version of the Ryan Plan, or they're going to keep losing, and their moment of reckoning, their sort of Bill Clinton style, you know what, we need to tack back to the center, is still a few years off.
Well, I want to open it up for questions, but we have as a captive audience here the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and so while it's been nice to talk about fiscal policy, I think I would be remiss in my role as journalist and moderator if I didn't ask you a little bit about what's been going on in the news recently. And I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit from inside the New York Times what it is like for the top editors to grapple with the immense velocity of sensitive information that has come your way on, from Snowden and others, on the one hand, and how you navigate that responsibility, and on the other hand, how you deal with the very close to home issues of governmental investigation of your news gathering.
Yeah, it is a serious concern for us. The government has, in recent years, done a series of investigations very much around New York Times stories We have, there was just a front page story in the Washington Post about there being a target, someone from the national security world who's a target of a government investigation for leaking information based on a story we wrote about Stuxnet and Olympic Games, which are essentially the US offensive cyber warfare against Iran. Jim Risen has been a target of federal investigations for years. The New York Times is not alone in this situation. The Associated Press is also in it. Fox News is also in it. Others have been in it over time. There's a chance that with the Snowden stuff, the Post and the Guardian will get swept up in it as well. And I acknowledge that there are really serious questions of national security that we in journalism have to grapple with when we get sensitive information. And we do grapple with them. When we get information that we think there's a risk of national security, we have conversations with people in government, and we hear them out about why they think we shouldn't print things on national security grounds. And sometimes we do withhold information on national security grounds. There are no easy calls there, right? Because the government knows that the only reason we'll withhold something is on national security grounds, right? If an agency calls us and says, we'd really rather you not print this because it makes us look like a bunch of bumbling fools trying to cover our bureaucratic behinds, we will print it. If they call us and they say, if you print this, it'll compromise American security around the world and you'll put innocent people at risk, we'll take that seriously and we'll consider it. But the fact that they know that, I'll let you guess how often when they ask us to withhold information, they make the national security argument. And so these are really tough issues. I feel very comfortable in the calls that we made. And I would add, I am very worried about the extent to which the current Justice Department and administration is getting very close to the line of criminalizing journalism and free expression.
On that scary note, let's open it up for questioning. The gentleman with his hand up in the blue shirt right there. I'm going to wait for the microphone. Great, terrific.
Good morning, Wally Obermeyer from Aspen. I'm curious, with the federal government spending being about 38% of GDP, whether or not or why there isn't more discussion about improving government efficiency, that if you could take, say, a 10% savings out, that would be 3.8% of GDP, and it would seem to be that that would be a bipartisan effort. Has anybody considered hiring McKinsey on a big scale, or do you have a sense of how much slack we might be able to improve or get out in terms of efficiency gains?
I think this is a big lob to David because he's got this wonderful line in his book about how we need to deal with the deficit we have rather than the deficit we imagine we have. And one of the pieces of the deficit that we imagine we have is this sort of bugaboo of waste, fraud, and abuse in government, which is not to argue with your point that I'm sure we could do things more efficiently, but.
So do you say 38% federal government?
I don't think that's.
So if you're just looking at it year by year, the federal government is closer to 20%, but when you include state and local, you get up not that far from your figure. So exactly, I would say there are two answers to that question. The first is the federal government is inefficient, and I think could do a lot more. I think if you run into a member of the Obama administration, current or former here, actually Peter Orszag and Jack Lew would be two of the best people to talk about this. They'll talk your ear off about how they completely agree. They try to do all these things at OMB, the budget office, to do exactly that, and they'll give you a list of some successes, which I think are worth listening to. I still don't think that this administration has done nearly enough on exactly that, right? I mean, there is a long list of programs that don't have a huge claim on empirical evidence of working government programs, and I think it'd be really important to take a look at them. I still think, and this is what Ruth was talking about, that by far that ranks way, way down the list below Medicare and Social Security. So to me, for voters, the question of how we can find waste in government should come after the question of what Medicare benefits, what Social Security benefits am I willing to give up, what tax increases am I willing to pay, and what military cuts am I in favor of. And when you answer those four, I think then you can get to the question of how do I think the government should become more efficient? Because the portion of the government that's covered by these sorts of things will be at a 60-year low as a share of the economy within a few years. It's really not the problem relative to Medicare and Social Security. So we can definitely do some stuff there. I just think it's not at the top of the list.
You know, it's interesting, just to add on to that very good answer. We've seen these efforts, for years now, think about Al Gore and reinventing government. And one of the reasons it might make more sense to prioritize it than you've said is the kind of symbolic significance. Yes. So in order to convince taxpayers that they're going to need to ante up more in taxes, you do need to convince them that the government is spending the money that they already have wisely and efficiently. And so just as a matter of kind of politics and getting things done and symbolism, you might want to put a little bit more emphasis on dealing with what waste there is there without necessarily believing that that's the solution to the problem.
That's a better answer than mine. And it actually reminds me of the first time I interviewed Obama was shortly before Super Tuesday when the primaries with Hillary in 2008. And actually there was a funny story because I was interviewing him in the front of the campaign plane. And it was one of these times where you just realized how crazy those FAA regulations are about not using your cell phones, because as we were coming in for a landing in Kansas City, his BlackBerry rang as the plane was coming in for landing, and he picked it up and started talking to Michelle, you know, during the very moment when all of us are on a plane, you know, the pilots are screaming into you never to pick it up. And he used a phrase during that interview, iPod government, right? This is back when iPods were the new thing rather than iPads. And his idea was government should feel simple and elegant and it should work like an iPod. And I think whatever kind of list people in the administration could give you about the ways in which they've made government inefficient, and I don't doubt that they have made some real progress there, the fact is none of us know them off the top of our head. None of us feel like, wow, Obama's really created an iPod government. And to Ruth's point exactly, I think there's a big opportunity there, whether it's for a Democratic president or a Republican president, to make you feel like in a way that you just get that government works better.
All right, let's get in a few more questions. Sir, right in the front here. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you, John Debs, Palo Alto. Dave, thanks for your great columns over the years.
Thank you.
My question is, I don't know if you were here 2 days ago when Eric Cantor spoke, but if I was from Mars and I'd heard him, I would say, isn't it wonderful that we have this love-in Washington of this bipartisan effort to solve all the problems of immigration and so on? This is a sophisticated audience here. Does he just not get it, or he just feels if he says it enough, somebody will believe it, or isn't this part of the problem that just won't even agree? He'll pick his audience, and in the audience here, he'll talk about how he's for dreamers and all this other stuff, but it's not it's not what's happening in Washington.
Meaning he talked a lot more about bipartisanship and cooperation than you see.
If you'd been from Mars, you would have thought, boy, aren't those representatives of ours doing just a great job forgetting party affiliation, just working for the people?
Yeah. Look, the House Republicans are in a really tricky spot, right? Many of them, most of them, I think, correct me if you think most is wrong, their only vulnerability is real vulnerability is from the right in a primary challenge. They are at no substantial risk.
What's bigger than most? Yes, you're right.
Yes, okay.
You're right.
Supermost, ubermost. And so they are playing to those voters, right? And those voters don't want immigration reform, and they don't think global warming, many of them, is a significant problem. And I think we really are. I mean, this is a replay of what we saw with the Democratic Party a generation or two ago, in which they control the House. They have some reason to think they could control the House for a long period of time. But their control of the House and their struggles as a national party are intricately linked. You cannot separate those two things. And the question is, which way do they go? And I think immigration reform is going to be a really fascinating test case for that. The 3 possible outcomes are it fails, basically, and we don't get a significant bill. We see something we haven't seen before, which is a large portion of House Republicans voting for a bill that looks like something like the bipartisan consensus, which so far they haven't been willing to do. Or we get a repeat of this thing in which most of the Republicans vote against it, and Boehner passes it with some Democrats and may cost himself his job.
That's the critical thing, and since David is the self-declared optimist, I think I'm going to be the self-declared pessimist, but I think I would call it realist in the current environment, which is not the kumbaya bipartisanship that I didn't hear Eric Cantor, but that you say he described. I think if we can't get immigration reform done, comprehensive immigration reform, that is the just the absolute proof, if we needed it actually, of the dysfunctionality of our current political system. And of those scenarios that David laid out, the thing that depresses me most is the way in which we've seen the Speaker of the House box himself in by saying very explicitly, and for a very obvious reason, he is under pressure for his job, from his base, from his very rambunctious membership. Every time you think that your job is difficult, just stop for a moment and think, thank God I'm not John Boehner, because the man has maybe not even the worst job in Washington, he might have the worst, important job in America. A piece of you has to feel sorry for him. But he has said that he will stick by what we've come to know as the Hastert rule, that he will not allow immigration reform to come to the floor unless it's supported by a majority of the majority. Even if we get somehow with piecemeal reform and from the House in conference with a comprehensive reform from the Senate, even in a conference report coming back, the Speaker has said he wants to see a majority of the majority supporting it. That is hard to imagine happening, and so therefore it is hard to see comprehensive reform happening, which means it's very difficult to see significant reform happening, and it really pains me to say that. And so I'm hoping somebody's going to ask a question that's going to produce a cheerier ending or near ending to this terrific panel. Thanks to David. Questions? The woman with her hand up right there, and then, sir, I'll get to you right after her.
As the microphone goes, I'll put in one tiny point, which is I've increasingly heard Democrats say, let's call their bluff. They want to kill immigration reform. We're happy to keep winning presidential elections. We're not going to move it too far to the right just to get what they want.
Well, we usually talk about the Senate as being the dysfunctional body, and the Senate actually functioned rather well. We got 68 votes for a bill that neither side believes is perfect, and that's a good thing, ma'am. But what's the path forward?
Allie Phillips, and I'm not going to be optimistic.
Okay, well, we still like you.
You've mentioned addressing Social Security several times. How do you propose doing it that's palatable to Washington as well as the taxpayers?
I don't have my plan for Social Security, but I think there are a set of options, any number of which would work, so I'll talk about a few of them. And to be clear, Social Security is a much smaller problem than Medicare, right? But it is a problem once you start going out 30 years, 40 years. And it's reasonable to go out 30 or 40 years with Social Security because we know what the demographics are. And basically the problem is we've promised ourselves more benefits than we have been willing to tax ourselves for. And so unlike healthcare, where you got to worry about doctor autonomy and death panels and all this stuff, Social Security is actually fairly straightforward, which is we've got the how much we're paying out and the how much money we're collecting. And I think to the extent that there is something approaching a bipartisan consensus among policy types, I'm not saying it could pass Congress today, but I think often the consensus among policy types filters into the political system and does become law. It is essentially to make Social Security more progressive, which is to say, do some combination of cutting benefits a bit at the top or raising taxes at the top. And I think this makes some Democrats worried because they think it violates FDR's insight that once a program starts to look like welfare, it loses the public support. But I think the reality may be that inequality is now at such a high level in this country that a program like Social Security, if we try to keep it universal, will be spending money in ways that is hard to justify in a democratic society, because the voters won't be happy to see money going to the very top when the very top has already done so much better than everyone else in percentage terms.
And I just wanted to add one point about Social Security, which is a reasonably small and incredibly easily solvable problem, absent the politics that go along with it, which is, and I say this as somebody who wrote before the 2008 campaign a column urging the McCain-Clinton Commission on Social Security, assuming that incorrectly that those two were going to be the nominees of their parties, and proposing that it was in the interest of both parties to get it out of the way. But it's not just in the interest of both parties. The thing that is most heartbreaking about the failure to deal with this ultimately dealable problem is that the solution becomes more painful every year that we dither and don't do it. It requires additional costs from beneficiaries or from payers into the system who are ultimately beneficiaries. To solve the problem, every year we kick the can down the road. Sir.
Thank you. Marn Obernard from New York City. First, if I could just offer one optimistic thought. There is a way to fix the problem in the House where Republicans are always worried about the right and liberal Democrats worried about the threat on the left. It's reform the redistricting process, and in the interim, adopt open primaries. But that's going to take the public demanding it.
We'll get a good, but I'll let you get your question. California will give us a nice little laboratory on the second of those.
For sure.
Can I just, I totally agree with you. I would love to see redistricting reform. There are some political scientists who argue that we have managed to residentially segregate ourselves on ideological lines. So, you know, where we come from, Democrats live in Maryland, Republicans live in Virginia. That the argument is that redistricting reform alone might not actually have the hugely salutary impact that you're hoping for, but it's got to be better than the current system.
We got to take a step forward. The other thing that I really was raised my hand for is not to be too optimistic here, but your rosy scenario about the short-term budget includes some items that are one-time charges. Sequester, for one, which is a one-time thing, I hope. And many people are talking about reversing some or all of that. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got infusions this year that they will not get next year or in the following years. The wind down of the war is already built into that with no cushion for any other action that we may have to take down the road. And finally, economic growth that we're talking about will in fact raise interest rates. And that will put a significant additional burden on federal income.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. I think that if basically you're making the case that the people who say we don't have to worry about the deficit anymore, it's solved, they're wrong, I agree. All I would say is that relative to something like the weakness in the economy, relative to long-term unemployment, relative to just the state of the economy right now, I think the deficit is doing better. I think our fiscal situation in the near term is doing better than the health of our economy. And that's why I don't think we need to think that on the economics, the biggest priority is lots more cuts to deal with some of the uncertainty around the forecast.
And
you were going to say?
Finish up, but then on that reasonably optimistic note, we're going to need to conclude.
I agree that we shouldn't get into draconian cuts today or even in the short term. We should be investing in the infrastructure. But what we need is a long-term, a 20-year plan that puts us on a sustainable course that is believable and enforceable. That will free the markets. That will that will unleash the growth that we're looking for.
We're redistricting and electing you. Thank you very much.
The one, and I'll make this the last thing, you made one point about sort of extremists on both sides, which I think is important. I think when you look at the House and Congress, there are extremists on both sides. They're not just on the right by any means. The difference is the far left in Congress has almost no power. Obama steamrolls them on ed reform. He steamrolls them on including Medicare cuts in Obamacare. The list goes on and on and on and on. The left of the Democratic Party is not running the party in any significant way. The same is not true with the Republican Party.
Thank you very much, David. It was so much fun.